Vladimir Putin is trying to launch a nuke into space. That may sound like something made up for a Bond movie, but the weapon is very much real and is currently being developed by Russia. The White House warned Congress and its overseas allies about the doomsday device last week before details were leaked to the press. Not much is known about the bomb for certain, but it is thought to be a kind of satellite with a nuclear payload on board that could be blown up outside the atmosphere. If carried out, such an attack could have devastating consequences, not just for Russia or the US, but for the modern world as we know it. And it's hardly the first new space weapon under development. In fact, something of a space arms race is currently underway. Back in 2021, Putin blasted one of his own satellites out of orbit with a missile, the first test of such a weapon by any country in years, and China launched what could be an orbital nuke the same year and has deployed satellites with grabber arms that can be used to attack other craft. So, what exactly do we know about this new Russian weapon? Why on earth would anyone want to nuke outer space? And how does all that play into the new space arms race? News of the Russian nuke first emerged last week when Republican Senator Michael Turner, who was given a secret briefing on the technology, decided to go public. Originally reported as a destabilizing new capability being developed by one of America's enemies, the information quickly caused panic. Slowly, the pieces of the puzzle came together, and we now suspect that what the US was warning about is a nuclear weapon that can be deployed into orbit. According to the New York Times, the US began tracking the weapon's development back in 2022, after Russia carried out a series of secretive space launches. America's intelligence agency set out to find out exactly what they were testing, and almost 2 years later, the disturbing truth has now emerged. Putin is thought to be developing a nuclear bomb that can be placed into orbit, circling the Earth until it is detonated at a time of his choosing. The weapon is thought to be in development rather than active and deployed, and does not pose a threat to people on Earth, according to National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. But Washington was concerned enough about it that Secretary of State Antony Blinken was told to seek out India and China on the sidelines of the Munich Security Forum at the weekend and see if they could persuade Russia to back down. So, what would be the point of nuking outer space? This may come as a surprise, but humans have actually nuked space before, specifically America, which did it during a test dubbed Starfish Prime all the way back in 1962. The US blew up a 1.4 megaton bomb, around 100 times the strength of the bomb that leveled Hiroshima, 250 miles above the Pacific Ocean. It proved far more destructive than anticipated, not because of the blast itself, but because of the electromagnetic pulse, or EMP, that it generated. The EMP fried satellites in orbit, whilst also causing blackouts, power surges, and interference with electrical grids and aeroplanes back on Earth. Worse, it created a cloud of charged particles that fell into orbit, circling the planet and slowly shredding the delicate electronics of any satellite unfortunate enough to fly through it. All told, it is thought the Starfish Prime test knocked out a third of the satellites in orbit at the time, including Britain's first, which had been launched just weeks before. The test proved so destructive that the US agreed to stop pursuing the technology, and today, deploying nukes in space is banned by the Outer Space Treaty, which 130 nations have signed, including Russia. If a nuclear explosion in space proved damaging back in 1962, then a similar blast today would be utterly devastating. For starters, there's far more stuff in space for it to destroy, almost 7,500 satellites, according to a recent count by the Union of Concerned Scientists. Second, we are far more reliant on the stuff those satellites do, from communications to banking, weather forecasting, GPS tracking, and web browsing. It is no exaggeration to say that trillions of dollars of global wealth relies on those satellites, which would be wiped out if they were destroyed. Third, blowing up a bunch of satellites would litter Earth's orbit with dangerous debris like a kind of miniature asteroid belt, making large parts of it unusable. That would mean replacing the destroyed satellites And, in fact, getting anything into space would be much harder, potentially wiping out trillions more in future economic growth. Finally, it could fatally undermine security, especially in the West. The US relies more on satellites than any other country, and that reliance extends to the military, which uses them to track enemy missile launches and troop movements, guide its own precision weapons, and talk to its troops. Whilst military satellites are shielded against this kind of attack, they are not invincible, and there aren't that many of them either. Disabling one, even temporarily, could leave the US vulnerable to other forms of attack back on Earth. But this kind of attack is also indiscriminate, meaning it would wipe out not only America's satellites, but also Russia's and any others that happen to get in the way. That's why America is leaning on India and China, two other spacefaring nations, to speak to Putin. A nuke in orbit would be very bad news for them as well. For the same reason, experts believe if Putin were actually to deploy a nuke into space, it is unlikely it would be used as part of an attack. Doing so would not just weaken America, but also Russia, and cause a cascade of knock-on effects that would be hard to predict or shield against. Instead, most believe the point of placing a nuke into orbit would be as a kind of dead man's trigger. If the West ever got any big ideas about attacking Russia or taking Putin out, then he could blow the nuke to take the modern world down with him. Perhaps it is no coincidence that Russia's first tests of the weapon occurred just weeks before the invasion of Ukraine. Russia's space nuke, if it is ever developed or deployed, would be just the latest weapon designed to take out things in space. In fact, space weapons go back almost as far as space exploration itself. America developed the first missile to shoot down satellites not long after Russia launched Sputnik. Since then, the variety of space weapons has only grown, as have the number of countries fielding them. Russia was, unsurprisingly, the second country to pioneer the idea, coming up with the idea of explosive satellites that could be moved around in orbit. If there was something in space you wanted to take out, you steered the satellite close to it and blew it up, not unlike the space nuke concept, only with regular explosives. America also developed a missile that could be launched from an F-15 fighter and hit a target orbiting the Earth. China was the next to develop an anti-satellite missile, known as an ASAT, which it test-fired back in 2007, and was followed by India, which tested a weapon in 2019. The last test of an ASAT was by Putin, who blew up an old Russian weather satellite with one back in 2021, creating a dangerous debris field that came close to hitting the International Space Station, which had Russian astronauts on it at the time. That same year, China tested what some fear is an unstoppable nuclear weapon that skims the top of the atmosphere before crashing down to Earth. Two launches, conducted in July and August of that year, saw a space glider dropped into orbit which travelled at least part of the way around the planet before releasing a payload. Those payloads were then brought back down to Earth, striking targets somewhere in mainland China before the glide vehicle itself landed. A lot is unknown about those tests, but they caused a good deal of alarm when news of them became public. The fear is that the payload they dropped could be tipped with a nuclear warhead and some kind of mechanism which means it can change course as it falls. If so, that would make the incoming nuke very hard to detect and almost impossible to stop using current technology. Worried American officials said at the time that Washington does not possess anything similar to what the Chinese tested. What America does have, however, is an experimental space plane that could, in theory, be used for similar strikes. Very little is known about the Boeing X-37, which looks like a much smaller version of the famous space shuttle. What we do know is that it has taken part in 4 test flights to date, carrying secretive payloads on long-duration flights around the Earth. The most recent saw the X-37 dropped into orbit in May 2020, before being brought back down 908 days later in November 2022. America also possesses a range of missiles that could, in theory, be used to shoot down a satellite, such as the THAAD interceptor and the Aegis ballistic missile defense system. Another unusual space weapon are satellites equipped with robotic arms or nets, which could be used to either ensnare or fight with other satellites. The Chinese government is thought to possess one of each, though claims their primary purpose is to remove space junk. America also possesses several satellites with robotic arms attached that could be used in a similar way, though Washington denies they have a military purpose. Russia, China, and the US also possess a range of high-energy laser beams and microwave emitters that are designed to dazzle satellites from the ground and interrupt the signals they give out and receive. Moscow has particularly advanced jamming technology that has become public knowledge since the war in Ukraine began. In Moscow, for example, it is hard for drivers to get a GPS signal for their maps these days because the city is being jammed to protect it from Ukrainian drones. And at the very start of the war, Putin launched a huge cyber attack on a satellite array called Viasat because the Ukrainian military uses it for communications. The hack successfully brought down the communications network, but also inadvertently turned off a fifth of Europe's wind turbines and disrupted internet communications, showing just how unpredictable satellite attacks can be. When Kiev switched to Elon Musk's Starlink system instead, Russian hackers again tried to take the network down, though they were thwarted by SpaceX's coders. Russia also has a listening satellite, dubbed NUKE, which it can maneuver around in outer space, pulling up close to other communication satellites and loitering there. Though we have no way of knowing for sure, it is thought NUKE is eavesdropping, getting close enough to pick up messages sent to those satellites and relay them back to the Kremlin. And ever since Putin invaded Ukraine, NUKE has shown a particular interest in hanging around European satellites, sometimes for months at a time. Washington now plans to emulate the success of Starlink, which relies on a web of small, cheap satellites to provide communications, to replace its own large craft. Over the next 5 years, the Pentagon has earmarked $14 billion to blanket low Earth orbit with up to 1,000 small satellites. The idea being that, even if Putin were to set up a space nuke, he could never take out all of them at once, meaning America would still be able to track other Russian missiles and relay urgent messages to its army. So, Putin's space nuke isn't operational yet. It turns out it isn't the first nuke to be launched into space, and it is far from the only weapon designed to operate outside the atmosphere. But it is still cause for concern. Spy satellites, robotic arms, and space planes are one thing. Putting a nuclear bomb into orbit is entirely another. Even if the bomb is never used, it would set a dangerous precedent and may prompt other countries to follow suit to balance out the threat. The more nukes we put into space, the greater the chance something goes wrong, potentially wiping out a lot of our satellites by accident. Or the technology could be acquired by one of Russia's allies, for example North Korea, which may not think twice about blowing it up. Kim Jong-un is thought to have just one satellite orbiting Earth, meaning he has very little to lose and a lot to gain from causing an atomic explosion outside the atmosphere. An arms race is already taking place on planet Earth, with Europe, the US, China and Russia churning out weapons as global security crumbles. A concurrent arms race in space would provide yet another flashpoint which could spark a war, the likes of which the world has never witnessed before.